All right, I will say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. All right, begin by thanking all of our sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's father and mother, Shmuel ben Zechariah and Sarah bas Avram. And to thank Avram and Shane D. Kelman for dedicating all the Shurman Drushos this month in memory of Sarah Braina bas Yoshua Heschel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in Nechama. I will say with that, let us begin. An interesting daf today. We actually referenced it earlier on. Today's daf is Samich 60. We are picking up in Eretz Hashem on the bottom of Nun Tes Amud Beis 59b. 59b. So the Mishnah says as follows: Nazir shahayatame b'safek umuchlat b'safek. Okay, so we have a little bit of an interesting and intriguing situation. Like I said, we've already made reference to this case before. You have a Nazir who has, I must say, just so you understand, this is in line with the theme of the parak, because remember again, how do we open up this parak? Safek Tumah. Safek Tumah. So the opening mission of the parak, which again we just concluded yesterday, was the idea of two Nazirim walking down the road. And what happens? Ruvain, another guy, standing at a distance, right? We set it up in the Gemara that he's standing at a distance of at least Dalet Amas, right? In order that it's a Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim. So he goes ahead, Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid, excuse me, standing at a distance of Dalet Amas. And what does Ruvain say? Previous Mishnah? What does Ruvain say? Somebody became Tameh. I don't know who became Tameh. Fine. Then we went through the entire process that these two guys have to undergo in order to go ahead and figure out, essentially to cover their bases. That's really what it is, essentially to cover their bases. That was Mishnah 1. Mishnah 2 that we did yesterday then spoke about what? What happens if one of those two guys die, right? So how do you resolve the suffix? Continuing in this thing, so we're talking about one guy, so we're back to one guy now, one guy with multiple layers of suffix. So watch this. So Nazir shahaya tamei b'safek umuchlat b'safek. So we'll say we're talking about now a guy who was tamei b'safek. Now remember again, tuma in this context always refers to what? Tumas meis. So there's a suffix. Did he come in contact with a corpse? Now we'll say that's one layer of suffix, and then there's another layer of suffix, which is suffix isya mitzora. So I'll say, so take a quick look at the Rush for just a moment. So the Rush says over here, Nazir shahaya tami b'safek umuchlat b'safek. Sorry, we'll say actually not the Rush. I'm actually going to draw your attention to Likutei Rashi. You see, do you have that in your margin? Likutei Rashi? I have it on my page. It's on the right-hand side of the page. No? Sorry, okay. All right, hopefully. Good. If not, you'll listen. So the Likutei Rashi, right? Nazir, so if you see, it's about 8 lines in. Nazir shahaya tamei b'safek umuchlat b'safek shenitma b'meis b'safek biyom rishon shel nazirus b'safek hulo em nichlat v'nirpa biyom rishon shel naziruso. So I'll say, so ultimately, the way that Rashi or the Likutei Rashi is framing this case is essentially you have an individual who has a suffix tumah on the first day of his Nazirite vow, of his Nazirus, and there's also, it's not clear, is he healed from his tzara'as on that day as well? That's the suffix that's unfolding over here. So I'll say, so therefore again, a double suffix. So the Gemara says as follows. Actually, not the Gemara yet, sorry. Fine. So the Mishnah goes on, and the Mishnah says, so what happens? We'll say, Ochel b'kachim achar shishim yom, v'shosi yainam etamel amesim achar meve esim yom. So we'll say, in a case like this, so ultimately, again, he drinks wine, he's able to go ahead. Ochel b'kachim, he's able to eat kachim, which refers to karbanos, after 60 days. So we'll say, what that means is, his tumah is essentially fully resolved after 60 days. The shosam etamel amesim achar meve esim yom. And his nazirus is only completed after 120 days. Okay, so I'll say, so now listen to this. So why is that? So take a look again at Likutei Rashi. right? So we'll say, so again, take a look at the Kuti Rashi, right where we were before. Right, it says, Ochel bekachim achar shishim v'shosei yainim v'tam v'mesim achar meh v'esem yom. So we'll say, so here, this is just going to help frame what it is that's unfolding over the course of this Mishnah. So take a look. He says, she'ilu im hayatame v'adai umuchlat v'adai hayitzarach legaleach la'alter taglachas tzaras ubesof shiva yomim l'mei sifro. So we'll say, so remember again, let's just translate over here. If he was definitively vadai, right, and ultimately again, definitively a mukhlat, i.e., right, definitively a mitzorah who has been healed, he would be obligated to go ahead and shave immediately, right? Taglachas saras, he would be obligated to shave immediately to remedy his saras. Ubesof shiva yomim, and at the end of 7 days, because remember again, the purification process for saras extends 7 days. So Shiva Yimei Limei Sifro Megaleach Shenis, he would shave again. Umevi Carbon Va'ocha Bakachim. He'd be able to go out and bring carbon, and he kachim. That would be in a case of where we definitively knew his status. The Achrakach Limnos Shiva Yamim, the Taglacha, the Tuma, the Achrakach Limnos Shloshim Naziros. So we'll say then he'd finish off the Tuma, then he'd do another 30 days ultimately again of Naziros. Because most times we've already established, remember again, what did we emerge from the previous sugya? That saras is docha naziros. Right? So we'll say, remember again, what does that mean practically? So we know that halacha lamaisa, a nazir, is not permitted to shave his head. But yet again, part of the purification process for saras is shaving your head. And therefore we learned out either from Rosho or Zikano, remember again, that was the whole drasha, that the hair cutting of Mitzorah is docha, the prohibition of not cutting your hair by a Nazir. So he goes on in the Kutei Rashi, he says, so Kesan lekaman be'idach pirkin, the taglachas hanega docha the taglachas hanazir, bizman shu vadai, velo bizman shu safek. Okay, so we'll say, see here it is. But the only time that hair cutting of saras is docha, the prohibition to cut your hair of a nazir is when there is a definitive obligation as a mitzorah, right? That's when there's a definitive obligation. That's when ultimately, again, you cut your hair even as a nazir. However, so we'll say, so again, we're not going to do the rest of this, but essentially what you begin to see is here's what's at play over here. See, I will say, the problem is when you have suffix cases, so safek do not necessarily allow you to set aside prohibitions. So because of that, when you have this situation of a nazir, right, a guy who was definitive. So if you look at this case, the only thing we definitively know is what? That he's a nazir. That's what we know. What ended up happening over here? So now he contracts tuma b'safek. Possibly became exposed to a corpse. That's possibility number one. Possibility number two is it's a suffix whether or not he's healed from his saras. So I'll say, because we have two speikos, the Mishnah explains, and again, you could look at the rest of Rashi, Rashi puts out all the calculations, which we don't need to go through ourselves right now to get the point of the Mishnah. But the point of Rabbi is when you go through all the speikos and work them through, he's only cleared from his tumah after 60 days, and he's only cleared from his naziros ultimately after 120 days. Fine. Why? Here it is. Shetaglachas hanega docha taglachas hanazir. Because when do we say that ultimately cutting your hair for tsaras ultimately is docha, sets aside the prohibition of a nazir to cut his hair? Bizman shuvadai. Only when there is a definitive obligation. Ava bizman shu safek in a docha. But ultimately, again, when it's a suffix, ultimately suffix is not docha. So I will say, because suffix is not docha, therefore, again, it's going to take a much longer amount of time to work through all of these sfeikos. Fine. So I'll say that's the Mishnah. We actually referenced this earlier as well. Take a look at top of Samech. So it says the Gemara, Tana, when is this so? I will say, when is what so? When is it so that you have to wait 120 days, right? In this case of suffix, that it's going to take 120 days to work through all of the sfeikos and be permitted to drink wine and become tamei l'meisim, i.e., when is it going to take 120 days in order for your neder nazirus to be completed? Ultimately, again, ben nazirus mu'atas. That's talking about, Rabbi saying nazirus mu'atas. What's a nazirus mu'atas? Remember, 30 days. 30 days. Rabbi saying, obviously, it goes without saying, the longer the duration of the naziros, then what? the longer it's going to take to rectify the suffix. So therefore, he says, Aval benazirus bas shana. But for example, if you have a nazirus that would extend for a year, ochel bekachim, you can only eat kisra. Say this would be the same case. You have a nazir who has a 1 year neder nazirus, and then what happens? What happens? There's a suffix tuma and a suffix whether or not he was healed from his tsaras. So now he has upon him a neder naziros for a year. So we'll say for a guy like that, it's going to take as follows. He says, ochel bekachim la'achar shtei shanim. It's going to take 2 years to ultimately again allow him to come to a state of tara where he can eat kachim. The shosam tam lemesim la'achar arba shanim. And I will say it'll be 4 years. It'll be 4 years ultimately again until his neder naziros is successfully completed. And I will say, by the way, what an incredible musar. I will say, you know what the worst thing in life is? The worst thing in life is suffix. Suffix. So I will say, when you live, that's why the Gemara Chazal tell us, ein simcha ka'ataras hasvekos. There is no greater joy in life than resolution of doubt. See, I will say, in life, if I know, think about it just a moment. If I know that I'm tameh, metaphorically, what does this mean? If I know that I'm wrong, I know that I'm doing things wrong, right? Don't raise your hand, right? By the way, right? We all know we're doing things wrong. At least if I know that I'm doing things wrong, then what? I know what I have to fix. I know what I have to do. Maybe I'm not even doing it now. Also, we've spoken about this a lot, like in the last week. There are many times in life where I know I'm doing something wrong, and I know I'm not fixing it now. I'm not even attempting to fix it now. That's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but lamaisa, as long as I know that it's wrong, there's a chance that Emirat Hashem, I'll get to fix it in the future. When a person lives in suffix, Rabbi say, so what ends up happening? So now my whole life is in this ambiguity, right? It's gray, is it right, is it wrong, is it this, is it that? It takes years. Everything takes so much longer to resolve. That's the Musar Haskell over here. When you know your tameh, okay, there's a process. I'm going to get through it. I'll get to the end of it. I'll be fine. Suffix is like a fog. It's like a fog. I don't even know where the end is. And the truth is, in a fog, it's also so easy to get lost. Such a musar. The Gemara goes, right, Tani Allah, we said about this case, Umigaleach arba taglachios. So we'll say in this case of suffix, what's end up happening is it's actually 4 head shavings. 4 haircuts, 4 head shavings. Listen to this. So we'll say, so taglachas rishona. So we'll say for the first taglachas, for the first head shaving, maybe tziporim. Ultimately, again, the Nazir will bring his bird offerings. I will say now, remember again, those bird offerings are for his saras. So the first head shaving, right, he'll go ahead and that'll be a head shaving for saras. He'll bring his bird offerings, the chatas ha'ov va'olas behema. Furthermore, again, I will say he'll bring his chatas ha'ov va'olas behema. Now, what is that for? That's for being a mitzora tameh. So in the first hair cutting, that's where he addresses his saras and where he addresses being a Nazir tameh. Fine. Shnia, second hair cutting, maybe chata sa'of va'olas behema. He'll bring chata sa'of ultimately again and olas behema. Fine. Shlishis, third hair cutting, maybe chata sa'of va'olas behema. Same karbanos. Revius, maybe karbantara. Only by the time you get to the 4th hair cutting, now I'll say, now remember, the timing of these hair cuttings all depends on what? The duration of the Nazirus, right? The duration of the Nazirus. So remember again, that's why, like, for example, the 60, 120 days that the Mishnah brought down was dafka for a Nazir Mo'ates, a 30-day Nazirus. Obviously, again, the longer the Nazirus, the longer the timeline is extended. The common denominator is no matter how long the Nazirus itself actually extends, halacha l'maisa, there's always going to have to be the same 4 hair cuttings and the same 4 karbanos brought with each of those hair cuttings in order to properly resolve the doubt. Beautiful. So the Gemara goes back there. Amrit, taglachas rishon. So we'll say, now let's talk about these 4 hair cuttings and what we're doing at each of them. So Amrit, taglachas rishon, in the first hair cutting, so we said, what do you bring? You bring your tziporim, which are your karbanos ultimately again for saras, chatas ha'of and olas ha'of, which are the karbanos for Nazir Tameh. So listen to this. So maybe, b'manav shach, shaper kamaisi. So I'll say the Gemara is not challenging. Interesting, what the Gemara is doing over is the Gemara is affirming. right? And the Gemara is saying, yes, that is the right choice of karbanos. Now, why is that the right choice of karbanos? So watch this. The Gemara says, so watch this. Because if the individual in question is a vaday mitzora and he's not tamei, so remember again, in any of these situations, what we have is multiple possibilities, right? Remember, the only thing we know definitively in this case is that this guy is a Nazir. Everything else is a suffix. Is he a mitzora, right? Is he tamei? So therefore, the Gemara says the way we just structure the karbanos essentially leverages all of the risks. So watch, it's actually fascinating. He says, listen to this: the vaday mitzora. Because if the Nazir in question is a vaday mitzora, the lav tamehu, but he's not tamei. So we'll say possibility one is he's an actual mitzora, but he's not tamei tumas meis. So then if that's the case, siporin chovaso, he'll bring ultimately again the birds as his obligation. Because remember again, the bird offerings are for who? Bird offerings are for who? Are for the mitzora. Now, so I'll just say something very, very quickly. You know, Rashi HaKodesh brings down in the pasuk in Parshas Mitzora, or Tazria, I think it's Parshas Mitzora, right? The karbanos of the Mitzora are birds, right? Rashi says, why does the Mitzora bring birds? Why does the Mitzora bring birds? Because why does a person contract tsaras, right? Because they're talking too much, like chirping, right? So the excessive talking that leads to lashon hara, right? That causes tsaras is like the chirping of the birds. So once I saw a beautiful Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh brings down, that's fine, but the Mitzora brings how many birds? 2 birds. And in fact, what happens to the 2 birds, right? One of them is shechted, and what? One of them flies away. So he says, what's the pshat? And the Baal Shem says something so incredibly beautiful. He says, because in every act of lashon hara, there's dual liability. There's the negative words that you spoke. I will say, but in those very same moments that I was speaking slanderous speech, I could have used my koach hadibor for something positive. I could have used those same words to build someone up. I could have used those same words to engender avas Yisrael. So in other words, that the shechted bird represents the avera, the bird that flies away represents the lost opportunity. And I will say, if you think about that duality, it really applies to all averas. Right? The real tragedy of sin is a compounded loss. Right? On one hand, there's the avera that I did. But the reality is, in that same moment that I was committing an avera, I also could have what? I could have done something positive. So every avera represents a dual loss. The thing that I did wrong and the lost opportunity that I had to do something good with that same time, with that same energy. Such an incredible idea in any event. So we'll say, so the Gemara says as follows. So the tziporin makes sense, right? Because remember again, we're talking about a scenario here where he's a vaday mitzora. So if the tziporin then would make sense, right? So the Gemara says, so godiva that v'laptami utziporin chavaso v'chata sa'of safek azal l'kvura. Now, both remember again the chata sa'of. Now, remember, interesting enough for us, we normally have a principle that a chatas cannot be brought out of safek. Interestingly enough, there is one exception to that rule, which is chata sa'of. Chata sa'of zrika can be done misafek, but ultimately, again, you would go ahead and bury the carcass of the bird afterwards. In other words, you wouldn't offer up the body. And remember, all you need is zrika anyway. So that's how you leverage the risk, right? Va'ola, and the ola that's being brought, havya nadava. Ultimately, again, that could be brought as a nadava, not a problem. The Gemara says, "Ulagalcho toch shiva efshar." Now, the truth is, the ability to go out and do another haircut at the end of 7 days is impossible. Why? The dilma lav muchlahu. Because also remember again, perhaps what? Perhaps he's not a vaday mitzora. Now, if you're not a vaday mitzora, then what? You can't do another haircut at the end of 7 days. Why? Because that's going to shter and undermine the naziros. V'rachmana amar tar lo ya'avar al rosho ad melos. Fine, so we'll say that's possibility number 1. Possibility number 2, ilav mitzora vadehu, right, v'hutame. So scenario number 2 is, again, he's a Nazir. Maybe he's not a mitzora, but he is vaday tameh. He absolutely has tumas meis. So now the karbanos make sense as well. Why? Chata sa'ov chavaso. If that's the case, ultimately, again, chata sa'ov will be obligatory for his tumah, for his tuma. Vitziporin avroi kamis avdin. And I will say anyway, the birds would be offered up outside, and therefore there's no problem of chulin la'azara. V'lo havi chulin ba'azara. V'olas behema havyin adava. And ultimately, again, the olas behema could be offered up as an adava. Fine, that's possibility 2. Possibility 3. V'in lav mitzorahu v'lav tamehu. They will say there is a third possibility. What's the third possibility? He's not tameh and he's not the mitzorah. Right? That's third possibility. And all he is what? All he is what? Just a Nazir. So listen, now watch this. So tziporin avrei kamisab. Then the birds are offered up outside anyway. Therefore, again, no problem of chul nazara. Chatas ha'of lekvura. Ultimately, the chatas ha'of, you can do the zrika, but you won't offer up the body on the mizbeach. It'll be buried. Right? Olas behemia havyachavaso. And ultimately, again, the olas behema will satisfy his obligation. I v'haba yasham. But 1 second, you still require an asham. In other words, we'll say the asham is from a surah. What are you doing about the asham? In other words, you still have to leverage your risk. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon da'amar maisi umasni. It's Rabbi Shimon who holds that halacha l'maisi. You can bring the asham, but you bring a conditional asham. And we'll say, what's a conditional asham? We'll say, if you take a look at Rashi, it's almost right across in Rashi. In other words, if you just move your finger rightwards into Rashi, a few lines down. So Rashi says, Haman Rabbi Shimon he da'amar maisi umasni ki darmina parak basra that mesechas menachas Rabbi Shimon omer lemachras maybe ashamo velugo imo vaomer imitzor hu ze ashamo v'zelugo v'imlav asham ze yeshamei nedava. So what's Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that interestingly enough you could bring a conditional asham. Rabbi say interestingly enough the sacrificial rights for an asham are the same sacrificial rights for a nedava. So Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that you could bring a conditional asham and just stipulate if I'm required to bring the asham, it should be an asham, and if not, what? It should ultimately go ahead and be a nedava. Says the Gemara. Fine, umasni. Taglach hashnia ushlishis tziporin lo tzarech. So we'll say if this is the case where he's not right, where he's not going to be tamei, or he's not a mitzora. So if that's the case again, taglach hashnia ushlishis tziporin lo tzarech. You don't need the second hair cutting. You don't need the third hair cutting. You don't need the tziporin. The ha'avid. So ma'ika. So ultimately again, I will say. So what chashash would we have? Dilma vadai muchlatu. So we'll say perhaps, ultimately again, he is a vadai mukhlat, in other words, mitzora, to which the Gemara says, chada l'safek sifro, the chada l'safek tum aso. If that's the case, I will say, ultimately again, one bird, one oaf, would come to go ahead and for the safek sifro, I will say, remember again, refers to the days of Tara, and ultimately again, one for the safek of his tumah. And I will say now what's interesting about this is as follows. So the Rush points out over here, he says, Bein taglachas adam rishon kimo shishi shvi. So this would be referring, remember again, the chap over here is if he's a suffix mitzora. So remember again, we have 2 hair cuttings that are occurring, one on day 1 and one on day 7. So the Gemara suggests over here that halacha lamaisa, one oaf would ultimately be for the suffix sifro. Suffix sifro ultimately means for the suffix of the counting of days 1 through 7, and one for the suffix of his tumah. Taglachas revius. But we'll say, what about the 4th hair cutting? So again, remember, just that's what we're doing over here, right? Remember, we said before in the Gemara that halacha l'maisa, there are 4 hair cuttings, right? And in each of the hair cuttings, there are different karbanos which are brought. We're just going through the 4 hair cuttings and what is brought at each stage. I will say last line, Samech Amid Aleph, 68. Taglachas revius. What happens at the 4th hair cutting? Maybe carbon tara. Ultimately, again, you bring a carbon tara. As well as remember again, what does the 4th hair cutting represent? What does the 4th hair represent? End of the road. At this point in time, what you've done, Rabbi, is you've gone through all the different scenarios, offered up all the different combinations of carbonos. 4th hair cutting, maybe carbon tara. You bring your carbon ultimately again for tara, umasni, and I will say ultimately again, you make the following. Umasni. And ultimately, again, you make the necessary conditions. Says the Gemara, on the days, V'i vadai naziru. So ultimately, again, if he's a definitive, right? Ivadai naziru, ola harishona chova, v'zunadava. Ultimately, again, the first one will satisfy my obligation, and this carbon should be a nedava, v'tame umuchlatu. And ultimately, again, if he's a tame and a muchlat, i.e. tumas meis, and a mitzora, ola harishona nedava. The first ultimately again should be nedava. V'zu chova, and this ultimately again should be the obligatory carbon. V'zeh, both say the zeh refers to the chatas and shlamim. Shar karbana ultimately again should satisfy the rest of my carbonic obligations. Fine. So the Gemara says, Tamei Safek Umuchlat Vadai. What happens, Rabbi Yosef, if we're talking about a case of where he is definitively Tamei? I'm sorry, Tamei Misafek, but ultimately, again, definitively a Metzora. Ochel Bekachim La'achar Shmona Yamim. He has the ability to go ahead and eat Kachim after 8 days. V'shose yayin u'metami l'meisim la'achar shishim v'shiva yamim. And ultimately, he has the ability to go ahead and become tami l'meis. I should say his nazirus is over, i.e. he could drink wine and become tami l'meis after 67 days. I will say, so we're just transitioning over here now. We've gone through, right? So now we've effectively dealt with, right? We've effectively dealt with the first category of cases. What's the first category of cases? That's the Mishnah's case. Mishnah's case is definitive Nazir, who what? Who finds himself overwhelmed with Safek. That happens in life. Sometimes you lose yourself in the Safek. Right? So we'll say, what are his Safekas? Safek number 1, Tumas Meis. Safek number 2, Saras. Saras. We'll say, so now we've seen how do you effectively deal with that? Well, first of all, here's what we know. We know that Rabbi says, in order to resolve all of that Safek, how many haircuts? How many haircuts? 4 haircuts. Each of those haircuts are going to require different karbanos at different intervals in order to address all of the different layers of Safek. What's the duration of this process? What's the duration? Well, the Mishnah just deals with the Nazir Mu'etes, so it's going to be 60 days until you eat karbanos, 120 days until your Neder Nazirus is over. But obviously, the timeline is going to be dependent on what? The duration of your Nazirus. The longer your Nazirus, the longer the process of resolution. But bottom line is, it's at least a 60, 120 day model, 60 days for karbanos, 120 days for Ender Nazirus, 4 haircuts, 4 shavings with different sacrificial rites at each of those intervals. Now, the Gemara is just transitioning to a different kind of case over here. Tamei Safek Umuchlat Vadai. What happens if you have a Nazir who is a Safek Tamei, but definitely a Metzora? So we'll say, what do you do in this case? Ochel b'kachim la'achar shmona yamim. So he's able to eat kachim after 8 days. Because we'll say, remember again, since he's a vadai metzora. So again, we know how to rectify his particular situation, and therefore he's able to go ahead and eat after 8 days. And ultimately, again, his nazirus is over after 67 days. After 67 days. Muchlat Safek Tamei Vadai was what happens if you have a guy, ultimately again, Safek Metzora, but definitively Tamei. Ochel B'Kachim La'achar Shloshim V'Shiva Yamim. In this case, he could eat Kachim after 37 days. V'Shosiyanim V'Tamei L'Meisim La'achar Shiva V'Arbaim Yom. And ultimately, his Neder Nazirus is over after 74 days. 74 days. I will say, the rush on the side goes through all the calculations. With this, again, I will say it's the same mechanism we saw before. Tamei vadai umuchlat vadai. So I'll say finally we're up to a case of vadai. What happens if you have a guy who is tamei vadai muchlat vadai? So he's a Nazir. He's definitely tamei tumas meis, and what? Also definitely a metzora. So I will say in this case, ochel bekachim la'achar shmona yamim. He has the ability to kachim after 8 days. I will say, so remember again, because remember we have the purification process for tzaras and the purification process for tumah, which each span what? Each span 7 days. Now remember again, after that tumah is resolved, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, he has the ability to eat kachim. V'shosiyanim v'tamei l'meisim la'achar arba'im v'arba'a yomim. And ultimately, again, he's able, his Neder Nazirus is going to be over after 44 days. Fine. Shalu Talmidim, Rabbi Shimon Yochai. So let's listen to this. The Talmidim asked Rashbi, Nazir tar umitzora maushi galech taglachas achas. So we'll say this is okay, so switching gears now. So we'll say, so listen to this. The Talmidim of Rashbi asked him the following question. We'll say, listen to how beautiful this is. What happens in the following situation? A Nazir tar who's a mitzora. Who's a Metzora? So now, not the same cases. Going back to what we originally had, right? I have a guy who's a Nazir. David Hatzlacha. So the life of Hatzalah member. Mamish, don't get a minute. So listen to this. So Shalu Talmidav es Rabbi Shmuel Silber. So listen to this. The Talmidim asked Rashbi as follows. What happens if a person is a Nazir tar and a Metzora? Now I will say, so take a look. At Rashi. So in Rashi, we'll say it's in the intermediate lines, the middle lines. So Shalo Tamim this Rabbi Shimon Yochai Mipnei Ma Nazir Tar. No, actually, no, not yet. Okay, so let me just say this outside. That was a good rush here that I wanted to show you. Okay, fine. So we'll say, here's the question. You have a Nazir tar and a Metzora. We'll say, here's the case. The case where, imagine the following situation. Reuven, we'll call him, is a Nazir who contracted saras. Happens to the best of us. So now what happens? It happens to be his Nazirus concludes on the same day that he begins to count his Yemei Tara for Nazirus. Now, boss, remember again, a Nazir, how long is the purification process of a Nazir? How long? 7 days. 7 days, right? So 7 days. What do you do on the 7 days? What happens on day 1? Haircut. What happens on day 7? Haircut. The case in question, as Rabbi say, day 1 of his purification process for Tzaras happens to coincide with what? The last day of his Nazirus. So we'll say, what's the shaila? Could one haircut count for both? That's the shaila. Could one haircut count for both? Right? I'm going to cut. Right? So Reuben's going to cut his hair. He's going to shave. Because also remember again. Now remember, what does Metzora have over Nazir? What does Metzora have over Nazir? Metzora is not just the haircut, right? What's Metzora? What's Metzora? Full body shaving, right? So obviously Nazirus only has just the haircut, but Lamaisa, the shaila is on the din of the haircut. On the din of the haircut, could one haircut satisfy both obligations, right? So Nazir tar u'mitzora ma'ushi galech taglachas achas va'olalo lekanu lekan, and it should count for both. Amar lahen, Rashbi responded, Ein lo megaleach. No, it does not work. It does not work, right? At the end of the day, one haircut ultimately, again, will not go ahead and work for both. Amar lo lama. So I said to him, I understand why not? A haircut is a haircut is a haircut. So why wouldn't one haircut go ahead and work for both, in other words, to satisfy both obligations? Amar lo, listen to this. Amar lo, this is incredible. Ilu zelagadol v'zelagadol. So we'll say, listen to this. Because in order for a haircut to work for multiple obligations, the obligations have to really be addressing the same criteria. So for example, if the point of the haircut was for the hair to regrow for both of them, or if the point of the haircut was to remove hair for both of them, then ultimately again, Yafa atem omrim, you're saying good. Achshav nazir laha'avir u'mitzora legadel. They both say they have two different purposes. What's the purpose ultimately again of the haircut for the nazir? What's the purpose? What's the purpose? To remove that which grew during the Nazirus. Ultimately, again, what's the purpose of the Metzora? To ultimately, again, regrow the hair afterwards. Well, so take a look at the Rush for just a moment. The Rush articulates this very beautifully. In my Rush, it's 4 lines up from the bottom. Nazir lahavir, hu ma'avir se'ar legamre, ve'eno tzarech legadlo o l'shem mitzvah. So Rabbi say, when a Nazir cuts his hair, so we'll say, what does a Nazir do? What is he doing when he cuts his hair? His goal is just to remove. Does he have any obligation to regrow? Is there any regrowth obligation by a Nazir? None. Conversely, look at the Rush. Mitzor legadel betaglachas rishona shel mitzora tzarech legadel saro kedei legal choshenis la'achar yimei sifuro. Oh, they will say, watch this. When a Nazir shaves on day 1, they will say, what's the goal? What's the goal? What's the goal? To shave again when? Day 7. So Rashbi says the haircuts have 2 different purposes. For the Nazir, it's to remove that which has grown, and we don't care about regrowth afterwards. For the Metzora, it's to shave and then to regrow for whatever degree is possible, because there's going to be another shaving when? On day number 7. So Rashbi says, therefore, because the haircuts serve 2 different purposes, one haircut cannot take care both of the end of the Nazirus and the first haircutting of the Tara of the Metzora. Incredible. Sa'ai says the Gemara, v'lo sa'lelo l'mechiluto v'sa'lelo l'meisifro. So Rabbi says, at the end of the day, so Rabbi says, so maybe halacha l'maisa, that I understand this logic applies to which haircut, I will say? To the first haircut of the Metzora. But maybe it should count for the second one. In other words, we'll say, at the end of the day, the Rosh says, "B'taglachas hashniya shala Metzora tala taglachas nazirus kevan shishneim lahavir se'ar." So we'll say, so maybe we should say, now we'll say, the question itself is a little bit lopsided, as we already know. But Lamai said, the Gemara says, why not? Okay, so I understand. So the Rashbi, you're saying one haircut could only satisfy 2 obligations when? if the hair cutting serves the same purpose for both. So therefore, the first haircut of the Mesorah can't count as the end haircut of the Nazir. Why? Because the end haircut, the haircut of the Nazir is what I will say to what? To remove hair with no obligation of regrowth, and the first haircutting in the Mesorah is to allow for regrowth. So maybe the second haircutting of the Mesorah should be able to count as the concluding haircutting of the Nazir, since what I will say, they're both for what? Removal with no obligation for regrowth. Take a look, I will say, ultimately at the Rush. Third line from the bottom. V'yalu l'meisifuro shegam hu lahavir. Fine. To which the Gemara says, Amar lahen. Amar lahen. So Rashbi says, you're right. Ilu zelifnei zvikas damim zelifnei zvikas damim yafa atomim. Both say, if the hair cuttings were sacrificially the same. In other words, if both of the hair cuttings took place before the zrika of sacrificial blood, I would agree. Here's the problem. Ela Mesorah lifnei zrikas damim, v'nazir la'achar zrikas damim. I will say the problem is, for the Mesorah, the hair cutting takes place before zrika, and for the Nazir, the hair cutting takes place after zrika. So I will say, so now, what Rashbi is saying is like this. In order for one haircut to satisfy two obligations, what has to happen? Number one, the hair cutting itself has to be done for the same purpose, right? In other words, in this case, hair removal with no need for regrowth. Number two, it has to be done at the same time in terms of the timeline for sacrificial rites. But for Mesorah, ultimately hair cutting is done before Zrika. For Nazir, the hair cutting is done after Zrika, therefore it's not going to work. I says more fine. For lo salelo limit saraso neziruso, the salelo limit saraso vitum also. So Rabbi says, so ultimately again, perhaps we should say that halacha l'maisa, so maybe you could use the same haircut, ultimately again for tsaras and tuma. In other words, if the Nazir became tamei, let those two. In other words, what was it? Now, all of this presupposes that your timelines coincide, right? That a Nazir who is about to become purified from his tsaras contracts tuma. So now he's a Nazir betuma. Ultimately, or I should say, the timeline for his Nazir B'tumah coincides with Saras. Now I want to use one haircut for both, and I will say this would seem to work because for both of them, the goal is hair cutting for the purpose of regrowth, right? And ultimately, again, the sacrificial timeline would seem to be the same as well. To which Rashbi says, Amar lahem, ilu zelifnei bias mayim, yafa ata omrim. You know what I will say? So Rashbi says, if both of them did it at the same time as mikvah, in other words, if mikvah was the same place in the timeline, I would agree. Here's the problem. Ela tamei la'achar bias mayim. I will say tumas meis. He cuts, for tamei Nazir, he cuts his hair from tumas meis. He cut his hair after immersion in the mikvah. Mesorah lifnei bias mayim. Ultimately, again, but from Mesorah, I will say, when does he do his hair cutting? Ultimately, again, before immersion in the mikvah. To which the Gemara says, Amrlo. So we'll say, we'll do over here as well. We'll pause here. So we'll say, so just understand what I want to do just a little piece on the parasha. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, what we're ending off over here is in the Shaila of Rashbi. And the Shaila of Rashbi is we're trying to figure out, we'll say, is there ever a case where you could multi-purpose one haircut? Right? So in other words, if I have a situation where multiple statuses are ending at the same time, and those multiple statuses all require a haircut, is there a possibility of one haircut satisfying multiple obligations? You see where Rashbi is going with this. So we see the writing on the wall, right? Where is Rashbi going with this? Rashbi is essentially saying, yeah, it could work, as long as what? As long as what? Everything aligns. The whole timeline aligns. In other words, immersion in mikvah is done at the same time. Zrika is done at the same time. The purpose of the hair removal is for the same time, which I will say, essentially, when you're going to see, that really never happens, right? That's never going to happen. You're not going to have everything, well, I shouldn't say that. It appears that you're never really going to get everything in alignment. Therefore, it sounds like what Rashbi is saying is that one haircut can't go ahead and satisfy multiple obligations. Well, let me just share with you a short idea in the parasha. Sorry. So we have the great zuchus this week to begin Chumash Vayikra, and of course, what's most notable, right? What the Baalei Kriya will say, what's most notable is what we call the Aleph Zeira, the small Aleph in Vayikra. So I'll say, so there's much written about why is it exactly that the Aleph is small in Vayikra, and of course, again, the idea that's most often brought up is that the Aleph Z, remember again, Vayikra means HaKadosh Baruch Hu is calling out to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Torah itself is explicitly indicating how the Ribono Shel Olam talks, calls out, right? It's not Moshe who has to initiate dialogue with God, but rather it's God who initiates dialogue with Moshe, which of course is an incredible, incredible accomplishment. Moshe Rabbeinu, in a display of humility, minimizes the Aleph. He minimizes the Aleph in order to go ahead and minimize the dynamics. So most understand the small Aleph as an expression of Moshe Rabbeinu's humility. So the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh makes an amazing observation. So here we have a small Aleph, but yet Rabbi say, if you skip to the end of Chumash Devarim, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ashrecha Yisrael, mi kamocha am nosha, praiseworthy are you, Klal Yisrael. Who is like you? Who is like you, a nation who has been saved so many times? So ultimately, again, the Baal Shem Tov writes, Kasav ba'alef rabasi. Shabbos say, the Ashrecha, the Aleph and Ashrecha, praiseworthy Klal Yisrael, is written large. Is written large. Shabbos say, very interesting. So the Aleph in Vayikra, written small, right? Reference to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Aleph in Ashrecha Yisrael, written large. Says the Baal Shem Tov, why is that? Let's listen to this. The idea being that when it comes to himself, Moshe Rabbeinu is humble. When it comes to the other, Moshe Rabbeinu magnifies the greatness of Klal Yisrael. When it comes to your own stuff, be humble. When it comes to Klal Yisrael, see the greatness. So we'll say, if we just reframe this a little bit, what the Rebbe is teaching us is something incredibly profound. So we'll say, when I look at myself, it's very important to be able to see my shortcomings. Like we were just speaking about in the daf, about not living in Safek. And I'll say sometimes in life, we're so scared to see our shortcomings because we're so scared to admit that we have frailties and we have faults. But the truth is, we always have it. That's the small Aleph. Small Aleph is when you look at yourself, I will say you should see, this is broken, that's broken. Again, not as a way of beating up on myself, but a way of being honest with who I am. Because if I'm not honest with who and what I am, there's absolutely no chance I'm ever going to fix it in the future. So when you look at yourself, you look with a small Aleph. But I will say, when you look at your fellow Jew, it's always with an Aleph Rabasi. When you look at your fellow Jew, it's always Ashrecha with a capital Aleph. You see the good. See, I will say, it's almost like natural human tendency that when you look at other people, what do you see? I will say, it's an incredible thing. I don't know why HaKadosh Baruch Hu programmed us this way. That pretty much you could look at any other person and you could size up their faults in about 9.3 seconds, right? We've never said a word to each other, but I can pretty much tell you exactly what's wrong with you, right? And I can even tell you how to fix it. That's what a chacham I am. I'll say, for some reason, like we have this predisposition to be able to just highlight and focus on the faults of the other. And the Rebbe is teaching us that's not the way a Jew lives. You look at another Jew, what you're supposed to see is beauty. What you're supposed to see is accomplishment. What you're supposed to see is a good kite, just a goodness in the other. Look at yourself, see the Aleph Z or the small Aleph. Look at your fellow Jew, see the large Aleph, see the good. Chevra, wonderful week of learning. Good Shabbos and Shkoyach.